Imagine this paradox. We live in an age where we can measure the heartbeat of stars thousands of light years away, yet many of us cannot feel the pulse of our own fragile planet beneath our feet. We have mapped the DNA of life, sequenced it like cosmic poetry written in 4 letters, yet we struggle to map the inequalities that divide our societies. We carry within our pockets supercomputers more powerful than those that carried astronauts to the moon, yet we often use them to argue about things we already know we disagree on. And here's the paradox that matters most for today's thought experiment. We understand so much about the sun, its age, its energy, its physics, its cycles, yet we barely grasp the extent to which we are utterly, helplessly dependent upon it. We imagine ourselves as free, as independent beings, masters of technology, architects of destiny. But if the sun were to so much as hiccup, if its light dimmed or flared or vanished, we would discover just how fragile our story really is. So let us ask a question that at first sounds absurd, almost playful, but upon reflection cuts to the core of our existence. What if the sun suddenly doubled in size? Now, before we leap into the apocalyptic consequences, and yes, they would be apocalyptic, pause for a moment to admire the audacity of the question itself. Humanity is the only species on Earth, as far as we know, that can imagine such a scenario. Lions do not wonder about the future of the Sunday. Whales do not calculate orbital dynamics. Ants do not ponder stellar inflation, but we do. And that act alone places us in a peculiar position. Creatures of dust, bound to one planet, yet capable of imagining the fate of a star. If the sun doubled in size, it would not simply be a bigger ball of light in our sky. Stars are not balloons you can inflate without consequence. Stars obey physics, and physics is merciless when its rules are bent. The sun, as it is now, bounces on a knife's edge, gravity pulling inward, fusion pushing outward. That balance is its heartbeat. Disturb it and everything changes. In this hypothetical, if our sun swelled to twice its radius overnight, its surface would cool, its brightness would shift, and its gravitational hold on the planets would remain largely the same because mass, not size, dictates the strength of its pull. But its radiation, its winds, its stability, those would transform our world into a very different place, perhaps one unrecognizable to us. But here's where the real story begins, not with astrophysics alone, but with perspective. When we imagine the sun doubling in size, we are not just describing a change in the sky. We are holding up a mirror to ourselves. We are asking, what is it that sustains us? What forces keep our world in balance? And how easily could those forces slip away? History is filled with moments when humanity confronted sudden change. The eruption of Vesuvius buried Pompeii in ash, freezing a society mid-gesture. The Black Death in Europe halved populations, reshaping economies, politics, and belief systems. The atomic age arrived not with a slow dawn, but with a blinding flash over Hiroshima. Change, sudden and overwhelming, is not just a cosmic possibility, it is a human reality. And so, when we ask what would happen if the sun doubled in size, we are also asking what happens when the systems we depend upon change suddenly, when the constants of our lives prove not to be constant after all. Science tells us that stars do change size. Our own sun will one day expand into a red giant, swelling to swallow Mercury, Venus, and perhaps even Earth. This will happen in about 5 billion years. To the cosmos, that's soon. To us, it's unimaginably distant. Yet the sun doubling in size tomorrow, that is imagination, not prediction. And imagination is where wisdom begins. Because imagination is what lets us see fragility before fragility becomes collapse. Imagination is what lets us prepare for what we cannot yet see. Imagination is what allows a species that once huddled in caves to now send robots to Mars. So, let us imagine in detail what doubling the size of the sun would mean not simply for planetary orbits and solar physics, but for us here on this little blue dot. And as we imagine, let us also reflect on the other suns in our lives, the forces that sustain us, invisible yet vital, fragile yet assumed permanent. Our atmosphere, our ecosystems, our democracies, our bonds of trust with one another. Because the sun doubling in size may never happen, but the collapse of balance in our own world that is already happening, slowly, quietly, like rings falling from Saturn, like glaciers melting into the sea. And if we fail to notice, if we fail to imagine, if we fail to care, then the consequences will be no less profound than if the sun itself had betrayed us. If the sun doubled in size, the first thing you'd notice is not what you think. The sun would not instantly engulf Earth, nor would our planet be ripped from its orbit. Gravity, after all, depends on mass, not radius. And in this scenario, we are imagining size increasing without mass doubling. That alone should tell you something. Appearances can deceive. Bigger does not always mean stronger. In fact, the larger sun would actually be less dense, its outer layers stretched thinner, its surface cooler. But to us, down here on Earth, none of that would matter. What would matter is the light. A star's size and surface temperature determine how it shines. If our sun suddenly expanded, its color would shift slightly toward the red, its heat distributed differently, its output of ultraviolet radiation altered in ways subtle but deadly. Plants would struggle to photosynthesize. Ozone, our thin atmospheric shield against harmful rays, could destabilize. The fragile balance we depend on for agriculture, weather, and habitability would unravel in months, if not days. Think about that. Our entire civilization, our cities, our technologies, our economies are all balanced on an atmosphere barely 60 miles thick, double the sun's size. And that balance evaporates. But here's the deeper question. Why does this thought experiment unsettle us so much? It's not because the physics are complicated, it's because it reveals how fragile we really are. We like to believe we are in control, that our skyscrapers, satellites, and smartphones mean we have conquered nature. Yet one shift in the sun, one change in its steady glow. And we are reminded that our power is borrowed, that our story exists only within the narrow margins of stability granted to us by the cosmos. It's humbling, isn't it, to realize that while we debate politics, argue over borders, and fight over ideologies, the sun does not care. It burns with indifference, sustaining us without gratitude, capable of destroying us without malice. It is both our lifeline and our executioner. A cosmic paradox we orbit every single day without acknowledgement. And if you think sudden change is only a cosmic fiction, look closer at Earth itself. Nature has doubled its own suns before. A volcanic eruption can inject enough particles into the atmosphere to dim sunlight for years. In 1815, Mount Tambora erupted in Indonesia, causing the infamous year without a summer. Crops failed, famine spread, civilizations trembled, all because sunlight dimmed by a fraction. If a single eruption can bring humanity to its knees, imagine what doubling the sun would do. But let's not stop there. Let's scale the metaphor further, because in many ways, our sun doubling in size is no different from the challenges we already face. Climate change is not an overnight doubling of the sun, but it is a slow, steady intensification of energy trapped in our atmosphere. Misinformation spreading through digital networks is not a literal doubling of light, but it blinds us just as effectively to truth. Inequality is not a stellar inflation, but it destabilizes our systems just as suddenly, just as violently, when it reaches a tipping point. The cosmos gives us metaphors for free. The real challenge is whether we have the courage to read them. Now picture the night sky if the sun doubled. By day, the sun would loom larger, redder, more menacing. By night, its dominance would still be felt. The moon, pale and loyal, would orbit under its glare, tides surging with new intensity. Stars we once relied upon for navigation would pale in comparison. The balance of light and dark, one of the oldest rhythms in human history, would be rewritten overnight. And in that change, the fragility of human meaning would be laid bare. Our calendars, our agriculture, our mythologies, all are built on the constancy of the Sunday, double its size, and the bedrock of culture itself fractures. The sun is not just an energy source. It is the foundation of time, of ritual, of identity. We do not just orbit the sun physically, we orbit it culturally. So when we imagine it swelling, destabilizing, we are really imagining something more intimate, the collapse of order. But again, let me pause here, because this is not just about the Sunday, this is about us. We are creatures of fragile balances, dependent on constants we take for granted. The sun's light, the stability of seasons, the reliability of oxygen, the trust of communities, the functionality of governments. And when those constants shift, we face the same choice we would if the sun doubled, adapt, or collapse. History is merciless to civilizations that assumed permanence. The Mayans, the Romans, the Easter Islanders, all assumed their systems would endure. All were wrong. And if they could speak to us across time, they would whisper the same lesson. Saturn's vanishing rings whisper, nothing is eternal, not beauty, not stability, not civilization, not even the Sunday. So let us not waste this imagination exercise by treating it as mere science fiction. Let us instead ask, what are the suns in our lives, the constants we assume permanent, that could change without warning? And how ready are we to face that change? Because the sun doubling in size is unlikely, but the forces threatening our world, those are real. Those are now. Now, if the sun doubled in size, one of the most immediate questions you might ask is, would Earth survive? And in a strictly orbital sense, yes. Our planet's path around the sun would remain the same, because orbital mechanics depend on the sun's mass, not its radius. But survival is not just about staying in orbit. Survival is about conditions, habitable conditions. And that is where the story changes. The sun's expansion would stretch its outer layers, cooling its surface. It would no longer radiate the same sharp intensity of light we know today. Its spectrum would redden, shifting the balance of energy that Earth receives. Crops evolve, for our familiar yellow sun might wither. Ecosystems fine-tuned over millions of years might falter. The ice caps would respond, the oceans would respond, and eventually we would respond. It wouldn't take long for us to realize that doubling the sun is not just a thought experiment about astronomy, it's a parable about dependency. Because the truth is, we already live at the edge of tolerances. A few degrees warmer or cooler globally, and history shows us the consequences. The Little Ice Age of the 17th century chilled Europe enough to trigger crop failures, famines, and social upheaval. Now, with climate change, we're seeing the opposite: heat waves, droughts, and rising seas, all from just a fraction of a percent shift in the sun's energy balance as trapped by our atmosphere. So here's the sobering truth. We don't need the sun to double in size for catastrophe to unfold. We only need to ignore the fragility of balance. But let's go further, because the sun doubling isn't just an environmental story, it's a cultural one. Imagine the myths we'd weave if such a thing happened overnight. Ancient peoples once worshipped the sun as a god, a fiery deity whose moods dictated harvests and wars. If the sun suddenly expanded, even today, with all our science, some would see it as judgment, others as prophecy. In an instant, a cosmic event becomes a cultural rupture. And that's what I want you to notice. Sudden change doesn't just destabilize physics, it destabilizes meaning. When constants collapse, people seek explanations. In the vacuum of certainty, myths rush in. Sometimes those myths unify. Often, they divide. Think of the 1910 passage of Halley's Comet. Its tail, rich in cyanogen gas, sparked fears that Earth would be poisoned. Snake oil salesmen sold anti-comet pills. Panic spread, not because the physics were dangerous, but because the meaning was unsettled. Now imagine the sun doubling in size, the panic, the rumors, the collapse of trust. Even with satellites and data at our disposal, fear thrives when permanence is shattered. And that leads to another layer of this thought experiment. What would hold us together? If the sun doubled, would nations cooperate to survive or retreat into isolation? Would we share knowledge and resources or hoard them? History offers us both possibilities. The bubonic plague fractured Europe, but World War II catalyzed international institutions that still shape us today. Crisis can defy. Crisis can unite. The sun, in this thought experiment, is asking us which future we would choose. And that brings me back to a cosmic truth we too often forget. Stability is an illusion. Stars swell, planets wobble, moons drift, civilizations rise and fall. Even atoms, given enough time, decay. The universe does not owe us permanence. It never has. But here's the paradox. Fragility doesn't make life meaningless. It makes it precious. If the sun were eternal, we might take its light for granted. If ecosystems were indestructible, we might abuse them without thought. If civilizations were permanent, we might never strive to preserve them. It is precisely because things end that they matter. That is the lesson hidden in this cosmic imagination. A doubled sun would remind us of what we already know, but seldom admit that our lives, our societies, our planet itself hang on balances so delicate they can be shifted by the subtlest of forces. And yet, we have the rare gift of foresight. We can see fragility. We can imagine collapse before it arrives. That is our advantage. That is our crown. Because while Saturn's rings cannot choose to preserve themselves, while stars cannot halt their swelling into red giants, we tiny creatures on a pale blue dot can choose. We can recognize fragility, and we can act to protect it. The sun doubling in size may never happen, but sudden change that will happen. It always does. The question is not whether change comes. The question is whether we are prepared to meet it with awareness, responsibility, and courage. And that's the bridge this thought experiment builds for us. From astrophysics to ethics, from imagination to responsibility. Because after all, isn't that the real purpose of science? Not merely to describe the universe, but to give us perspective, to remind us that while we are small, our choices are not, to show us that while impermanence is inevitable, neglect is optional. So let us continue this journey. Let us follow the doubled sun outward, imagining not just its physical consequences, but its human ones. Let us ask what we would do, as a species, if the constants we rely upon suddenly shifted. And as we ask, let us turn inward to our own fragile systems, the climate, the trust, the compassion that sustain us just as surely as the sun's light. Because in the end, the thought experiment is not about the Sunday, it's about us. If the sun doubled in size, Earth would remain tethered to it, still bound by gravity's invisible thread. But the balance of energy, the subtle interplay between sunlight and atmosphere, between radiation and chemistry, between orbit and life, that balance would falter. Seasons would warp. Oceans would boil in some places, freeze in others. The jet streams, those invisible rivers of air, would buckle. And with them, the patterns that gave us stability harvests, migrations, rainfall, would twist into chaos. It's easy to think of this as pure astronomy, some distant what if. But look closer. Isn't this already happening in a quieter way? The sun hasn't doubled, but the Earth has warmed. Not by a factor of 2, but by just over 1 degree Celsius. And yet, even that small shift has given us floods where there were fields, fires where there were forests, refugees where there were cities. The cosmos need not double the sun to destabilize us. We are perfectly capable of destabilizing ourselves. So the thought experiment becomes a mirror. What would we do if the sun doubled? What do we do now as our own choices amplify the planet's heat, accelerate the melting of ice, alter the flow of oceans? The difference between cosmic catastrophe and human-made catastrophe is scale, not nature. Both remind us of fragility. Both force us to ask, what are we willing to preserve? If you stood on Earth under a doubled sun, the sky itself would look different. Our star, once a blinding coin of fire, would stretch across a wider patch of sky, tinged red, ominous, heavy. Shadows would lengthen, colors would fade under its strange hue, the night would not be the same either. Moonlight, reflecting a doubled sun, would saturate the night sky, drowning out stars that guided our ancestors across oceans. For tens of thousands of years, Humanity has navigated by the heavens, reading patterns in starlight. A doubled sun would erase those maps. And here again, the metaphor strikes. In our age, the stars are being drowned out not by a cosmic accident, but by our own lights. Light pollution now washes out the Milky Way from most cities on Earth. Billions of people will never see it in their lifetimes. We've exchanged the cosmos for convenience, the night sky for neon. And in doing so, we've lost not just a view, but a connection. To see the Milky Way arching overhead is to be reminded of scale, of humility, of belonging. To lose it is to live in a smaller universe. So when we imagine the sun swelling, blotting out stars, we should also imagine the smaller ways we blot them out ourselves. It is not just astrophysics that erases wonder, it is neglect. But there's more. A doubled sun would swell outward, perhaps nudging Mercury into oblivion, destabilizing Venus, tugging Mars ever so slightly. And though Earth's orbit would remain stable, the ripples of change would cascade. This is the nature of systems. Change one element, and the rest adjusts, sometimes subtly, sometimes catastrophically. We like to think of Earth as separate, insulated from cosmic drama, but it is not. We orbit within a dynamic system, shaped by gravitational resonances, solar winds, cosmic rays. Our planet is not a stage built just for us. It is part of a larger play, and the script can change. And here is where humility enters. Because when we realize how dependent we are on balances beyond our control, the illusion of dominance dissolves. We are not masters of the universe. We are participants. The sun doubles in size, and suddenly the skyscrapers, the armies, the economies, the ideologies, all of it shrinks before the immensity of physics. And that is not cause for despair. That is cause for perspective. Perspective is what science gives us. Without telescopes, the sun is just a bright disk. With telescopes, it becomes a star, a furnace of nuclear fusion. Without imagination, it is simply warmth. With imagination, it becomes fragility, responsibility, metaphor. So let us ask the question differently. Not, what if the sun doubled? But, what if our awareness doubled? What if, instead of seeing ourselves as isolated individuals, we saw ourselves as participants in the same fragile system? What if our sense of responsibility grew in proportion to our power? What if our compassion stretched as far as our technology? Because here's the truth. Our awareness is the real sun of civilization. It is what sustains us, what gives light to ethics, heat to progress, energy to compassion. And just like the real sun, if that awareness swells without balance, it can burn us. But if it grows with responsibility, it can sustain us. We often think of the cosmos as indifferent, and in a sense, it is. The sun doesn't care if we live or die. Saturn's rings will vanish whether we notice or not. Black holes collide in silence, their waves rippling through space-time, utterly indifferent to human drama. But science gives us something the cosmos does not: meaning. Not cosmic meaning, but human meaning. The act of noticing, of reflecting, of imagining that is where meaning lives. So what if the sun doubled in size? Then we would be forced to reckon with fragility. But we don't need the sun to change in order to learn that lesson. The fragility is already here. The question is whether we choose to see it. And maybe that is why we ask these cosmic questions in the first place. Not because we expect the sun to swell tomorrow, but because we need metaphors grand enough to shake us awake. We need to imagine stars collapsing, planets colliding, universes ending, not for their own sake, but because they help us see the delicate miracle of our own existence. And so let us continue with this imagination. Let us not shy away from the terrifying consequences of a doubled sun, but lean into them, because in doing so, we learn how to face the crises we can control. If the sun doubled in size, the physics would unfold in ways invisible at first, yet catastrophic in time. Stars are not solid bodies. They're spheres of plasma, balancing on a razor's edge between gravity pulling in and nuclear fusion pushing out. Right now, our sun burns hydrogen at its core, fusing 4 atoms into 1 helium nucleus every second, releasing energy that takes thousands of years to migrate outward and just 8 minutes to reach us. But a doubled sun would be a sun off balance. If its radius expanded while its mass remained the same, the pressure at its core would drop. Less pressure means cooler fusion. The star would shine differently, reddening, dimming in certain wavelengths, flaring unpredictably in others. Imagine trying to live under a furnace that cannot decide whether to warm you gently or scorch you. And if the sun's outer layer swelled, the solar wind, the constant stream of charged particles flowing outward, would intensify. Earth's magnetic field, our shield against that wind, would strain under the barrage. Satellites would fail. Communications would falter. Power grids would collapse. For a species that has wired its civilization together with invisible signals, Wi-Fi, GPS, global banking, the sun doubling in size would not just be an astrophysical event. It would be a technological apocalypse. And yet, pause, because don't we already live under a quieter version of this? Solar storms do strike Earth. In 1859, the Carrington event blasted our planet with a geomagnetic storm so intense that telegraph lines sparked, operators received shocks, and auroras danced as far south as the Caribbean. If such a storm struck today, satellites could be disabled, power grids could go dark, global communications could be crippled. It would not take a doubled sun to bring us to our knees. It would take only the sun as it is reminding us, again, of fragility. But let us return to our thought experiment. A doubled sun would shift not only the sky, but the ground beneath our feet. With oceans heating unevenly, hurricanes would intensify, droughts would deepen, and rainfall would move unpredictably. Crops would fail in some regions, flourish strangely in others. Species would migrate. Ecosystems would buckle. Humanity, adaptable though we are, would face the same challenge life has always faced. Adapt or vanish. And adaptation is the true story here. Life on Earth is a 4 billion year history of adapting to change. Ice ages came and went, continents drifted, meteorites struck, volcanoes erupted, and through it all, life persisted, reinventing itself, recombining genes, testing new forms. The question is not whether life could endure a double Sunday. It almost certainly could, though perhaps not in its present forms. The question is whether we could, because unlike the trilobites or the dinosaurs, we have awareness. We can imagine the future. We can plan, prepare, prevent. That is both our gift and our burden. When we ask, what if the sun doubled? We are also asking, what if we do not act when the signs are before us? This brings me to a truth that is both unsettling and empowering. The sun will, in fact, double one day, not tomorrow, not next century, but in about 5 billion years, our sun will exhaust the hydrogen in its core. And in desperation, it will begin fusing helium. Its outer layers will swell, ballooning outward until it becomes a red giant. When that happens, Mercury will be consumed. Venus will follow. And Earth, depending on the details, will either be swallowed whole or roasted into a lifeless cinder. It is a certainty. Stars are born. They live. They die. Our sun is no exception. One day the sky will change forever. But here's the irony. That distant inevitability is less important to us than the choices we make now. 5 billion years is unimaginably long compared to a human lifetime. But 5 decades, that is the timescale of our crises. Climate change, resource depletion, the erosion of truth and trust. These are the red giants already swelling in our world, and they will decide whether humanity thrives or collapses. The cosmos is showing us the script. The sun doubling is not just a stellar fate. It is a metaphor for all the constants we assume will never change until they do. And when they do not ask permission. They do not wait for us to be ready. They shift. And the only question is, did we notice? Did we prepare? Did we care? That, my friends, is why science matters. It is not just curiosity about the stars. It is rehearsal for responsibility. It trains us to see what is fragile before it collapses, to imagine what is possible before it is too late, to recognize that permanence is an illusion and that care is the only antidote to entropy. So when we ask, what if the sun doubled in size? Let us not dismiss it as an impossible scenario. Let us take it as an invitation to reflect on our own fragility, our own responsibility, our own place in a universe where nothing is permanent except the meaning we choose to create. If the sun doubled in size, it would not be the first time that humanity faced the collapse of a constant. It would not even be the first time that nature reminded us of fragility in terms too overwhelming to ignore. Our history is, in fact, a litany of sudden shifts moments when what we assumed to be permanent was revealed to be temporary. Take the Roman Empire. For centuries, it seemed eternal, its armies invincible, its roads unbreakable, its laws immortal. Rome believed it was the center of the world, its sun, so to speak, fixed in the sky of history. And then, slowly, particle by particle, the empire unraveled. Corruption here, neglect there, overreach abroad, apathy at home, until one day, the illusion of permanence was gone. The sun of Rome had doubled overheated by its own expansion, and it collapsed under the weight of its own brilliance. Or consider the Mayans, masters of astronomy, architects of pyramids aligned with the heavens. They tracked Venus, calculated eclipses, understood cycles of the sun with astonishing precision. And yet, they too collapsed, undone by ecological strain, drought, and social unraveling. They read the sky, but perhaps not the fragility of their own balance. In both cases, the lesson is not simply that civilizations fall. The lesson is that they fall when they assume stability is permanent, when they treat their sun, their structures, their constants as eternal. Now, imagine if the sun literally doubled in size. It would be the ultimate reminder of impermanence. The literal source of our days, our seasons, our time itself, suddenly rewriting the rules. Humanity would face a choice. And in that moment, history would repeat itself. We would either adapt together or collapse apart. And here's where the metaphor becomes unavoidable. The sun is not doubling, but our world is warming. Our climates are shifting. Our ecosystems are faltering. Our societies are polarizing. These are not hypotheticals. These are real. These are now. The parallels are uncanny. The Mayans faced drought. We faced drought. Rome faced overreach. We face overreach. Civilizations before us crumbled, not because they lacked intelligence, but because they failed to respond to change they thought would pass, or change they thought someone else would handle. And isn't that what we risk now? To shrug, to deny, to assume that because the sun rises today, it will always rise tomorrow in exactly the same way? But let's return to the cosmos. A sun that doubles in size would erase much of what we take for granted. Days would feel different. Nights would lose their intimacy with the stars. The patterns that guided agriculture, worship, navigation, art, all would dissolve. And in that void, we would have to reinvent meaning itself. And here is where the story turns hopeful, because humanity has reinvented meaning before. The Copernican revolution rewrote our place in the cosmos, shifting us from the center of the universe to one planet orbiting an ordinary star. The Industrial Revolution rewrote our relationship to power, harnessing fossil fuels and machines to reshape economies. The Digital Revolution rewrote our relationship to knowledge, compressing libraries into pockets, voices into networks, worlds into screens. Each time a sun doubled not literally, but metaphorically. A constant grew larger, destabilizing what came before. And each time we adapted, often chaotically, sometimes destructively, but eventually profoundly. So what if the sun doubled in size? Then we would adapt. Perhaps underground, perhaps into orbit, perhaps by terraforming Mars or building shelters that track the rhythms of a swollen star. But the point is not the adaptation itself. The point is the awareness that adaptation is always the only answer. Not denial, not nostalgia, not arrogance, awareness. Responsibility, participation. The cosmos is not cruel. It is simply honest. Stars swell, planets wobble, rings collapse, civilizations rise and fall. The universe does not ask us whether we like these facts. It simply delivers them. The only question left to us is, will we learn? Will we read the lesson? Will we act while there is still time? Because the sun will double one day, billions of years from now. But the forces destabilizing us now, climate change, inequality, indifference, those are not billions of years away. They are here. They are present. They are our red giants swelling before our eyes. And this, perhaps, is the greatest paradox of all. The universe has given us the gift of foresight, the ability to imagine what might come. And yet, so often, we live as though imagination were just a toy rather than a tool. We ask, what if the sun doubled? But do we ask, what if compassion doubled? What if responsibility doubled? What if our sense of planetary stewardship doubled? What then? Because that is the real thought experiment. The sun doubling in size would test our resilience, but awareness doubling in depth, that would test our humanity. What if compassion doubled? What if responsibility doubled? What if our awareness grew at the same pace as our technology? That is the thought experiment worth lingering on. Because a sun that doubles in size is not under our control. But the expansion of our care, our foresight, our wisdom, those are entirely within our reach. History shows us both possibilities. When the printing press was invented, knowledge doubled, then doubled again. Ideas spread, empires trembled, revolutions ignited. But along with knowledge came propaganda, censorship, war. Doubling one constant without balancing the rest creates instability. The lesson echoes the cosmos. Expansion alone is not enough. It must be matched by equilibrium. Our sun right now is in its prime a stable star in middle age. It has burned for 4.6 billion years and will burn for billions more. That stability is the reason we exist at all. If our sun flared unpredictably, life could never have taken hold. If it dimmed too quickly, Earth would have frozen. The balance is fragile, but it is also the foundation. The same is true for us. Societies thrive not because they grow, but because they balance growth with responsibility. Civilizations endure not because they expand endlessly, but because they sustain what makes them viable. Rome fell when its growth outpaced its wisdom. The Mayans collapsed when their expansion outstripped their environment. A doubled sun without balance becomes a red giant, a star that devours itself. A doubled humanity without balance risks the same fate. And yet, unlike the sun, we can choose. That is our extraordinary gift. Stars follow the laws of physics without deviation. They are fated to burn, to swell, to collapse. We are bound by physics, yes, but not by fate. We are free to imagine. We are free to choose. We are free to rewrite our trajectory if only we have the courage. Imagine standing on Earth as the sun swells in the sky. The horizon would glow not with the golden warmth of a familiar morning, but with a blood-red intensity, a looming reminder that nothing is permanent. Some would despair, some would panic, some would deny, but others, perhaps the ones listening now, would adapt. They would ask, what can be done? What can we preserve? What can we build to outlast this? And that is where the real lesson lies. Because we are already standing at that horizon, not under a doubled sun, but under double challenges. Our population doubled in the last century. Our technologies doubled in complexity every few decades. Our impact on the planet doubled and then doubled again. The sun may not have changed, but we have, and the question is the same. Will we despair, deny, or adapt? This is why the space race was more than a geopolitical contest. It was a rehearsal for resilience. When we left Earth for the moon, we proved that we could adapt to environments beyond our own. When we sent Voyager into interstellar space, we proved that our curiosity could outlast borders. When we built telescopes like Hubble and James Webb, we proved that our vision could pierce both distance and time. The space race was not just about rockets, it was about perspective. It was about teaching us that the constants of our world, gravity, atmosphere, sunlight, are not fixed limits. They are starting points, They are training grounds. They are reminders that fragility can be transcended, but only with awareness, with preparation, with care. So when we imagine the sun doubling in size, let us not see it as the end of the story. Let us see it as the metaphor it is, a challenge to expand not just our technology, but our wisdom, to build not just rockets that escape Earth, but societies that preserve Earth, to dream not just of surviving under a red giant sun billions of years from now, but of thriving under the fragile golden sun we have today. Because one day the sun will double. That is certain. But today what doubles is up to us. Will it be our indifference or our responsibility? Our arrogance or our humility? Our neglect or our care? The cosmos has already given us the metaphor. The rest is up to us, because one day the sun will double. That is the fate written in the language of stellar evolution. Hydrogen will exhaust, helium will ignite, and our star will swell into a red giant. That is not a prophecy, it is physics. But until then, we live in a rare golden age. A sun stable enough to nurture life, long enough for consciousness to awaken, long enough for curiosity to look outward, long enough for responsibility to take root. This is not trivial, it is extraordinary. Imagine a universe where stars lived only a few million years, burning fast and dying young. Life would barely have time to begin before the light went out. Imagine a universe where stars flickered wildly, dimming and flaring unpredictably. Stability would never last long enough for complexity to build. But our sun, steady, patient, luminous, is a cosmic gift. We exist because of its constancy. And that is why imagining it suddenly doubling in size feels so unsettling, because it reminds us that we are creatures of balance, dependent on fragile constancies. It is the same lesson Saturn's rings whisper across the solar system. From afar, they look eternal, magnificent, serene. But Cassini taught us the truth. They are temporary. Grain by grain, ice by ice, they are raining down into Saturn's atmosphere. Not in a day, not in a year, but over millions of years. Still, in cosmic terms, that is the blink of an eye. The sun doubling and the rings vanishing are different stories, but they share the same theme. Permanence is an illusion. What we take as eternal is in truth fleeting. The question is not whether these things endure. The question is whether we notice them while they exist, whether we learn from them while there is still time. And here's where the space race comes back into the story. When humans first looked back at Earth from the moon, they saw a world ringed not in ice and dust, but in the delicate halo of its atmosphere. Thin, fragile, shimmering. Astronauts described it as a blue marble in blackness. And they were right. From space, it is impossible to ignore how small, how vulnerable, how precious Earth truly is. That photograph, Earthrise, did more to awaken environmental awareness than decades of policy speeches. Because perspective matters. Seeing Earth from the moon is, in some ways, like imagining the sun doubling. Both tear away illusions of permanence. Both reveal fragility. Both force us to ask, what will we do with this awareness? We live at a crossroads. Technology has doubled and doubled again, granting us powers no previous generation ever dreamed of. We can alter genes, split atoms, warm the climate, watch black holes collide, photograph galaxies from the dawn of time. And yet, our wisdom has not always kept pace with our power. That imbalance, the doubling of ability, without the doubling of responsibility, is our own red giant swelling, threatening to consume us if left unchecked. But we are not doomed to repeat the mistakes of stars and civilizations past. Unlike Saturn's rings, unlike the sun itself, we have agency. We can choose balance. We can choose awareness. We can choose responsibility. And perhaps that is the true meaning of the space race. It was not simply about rockets or flags or winning. It was about demonstrating that when humanity directs its imagination outward, when it dares to dream beyond survival, it discovers perspective. Apollo gave us the moon, but more importantly, it gave us Earth. It reminded us that our world is finite, fragile, and shared. The next space race, our return to the moon, our journey to Mars, Our probes to the outer planets and beyond must do the same. Not just to expand our horizons, but to deepen our care. Not just to conquer new frontiers, but to preserve the one frontier we already inhabit. So what if the sun doubled in size? Then we would have no choice but to act. But here's the truth. We already have no choice. Our challenges may not glow red in the sky, but they are no less real. The climate is changing, inequality is deepening, trust is eroding. The rings of our own society, those delicate bands of cooperation, compassion, and responsibility, are unraveling, grain by grain. The sun does not need to double to test us. The test is already here. And the answer is not despair. The answer is not denial. The answer is perspective. The answer is responsibility. The answer is to live as though fragility is sacred, as though impermanence is not a curse, but a call to care. Because one day, the sun will vanish. The rings will vanish, we will vanish. But meaning is not found in permanence. Meaning is found in participation. And if we participate with care, then even when the stars fade, the echo of our choices will ripple outward across the cosmos, like rings in water, fragile, temporary, but beautiful and real. So in the end, the question was never really, what if the sun doubled in size? The question was, what happens when the constants we depend on prove not to be constant at all? The sun will swell one day. Saturn's rings will vanish one day. Earth itself will be swallowed or frozen or transformed. Impermanence is not the exception. It is the rule. The only exception is what we choose to do with the time we are given. And that is why the lesson matters now, because fragility is not weakness. Fragility is urgency. It demands our attention. It demands our care. It demands our responsibility. When Apollo astronauts looked back at Earth from the moon, they saw a world with no borders, no divisions, no illusions of permanence. They saw a fragile blue sphere, ringed not by dust or ice, but by the thinnest of atmospheres, our only shield against the void. That photograph, Earthrise, was humanity's first real glimpse of its own fragility. It was our first cosmic mirror. And here we are, half a century later, facing challenges that do not wait for the sun to double or Saturn's rings to collapse. They are here now. The glaciers are melting. The forests are burning. The atmosphere is straining. The delicate rings of our own civilization, trust, truth, cooperation, are unraveling, particle by particle. The universe is asking us a question. Will you notice? Will you care? Will you act? And perhaps that is what the space race was really about all along. Not competition, not conquest, but perspective. It was a rehearsal, a test of whether a species clever enough to reach for the stars could also be wise enough to care for the ground beneath its feet. The next space race will not be about flags and footprints. It will be about survival, stewardship, and meaning. It will be about whether we can take the lessons of fragility from Saturn's rings, from Earth's atmosphere, from the sun's inevitable swelling, and live as though we understand them. Because permanence is an illusion, but meaning is not. Meaning is what we create when we participate fully, responsibly, reverently in the fragile miracle of existence. So when the sun one day doubles, billions of years from now, we will not be here to see it, but our legacy will already have been written. And the real question, the question the cosmos keeps whispering, is this: will we be remembered as the species that mistook fragility for weakness, or as the species that finally understood fragility as a call to care? That choice is ours. And it begins not with the sun, not with Saturn, not with the stars, but with us.